The AFEBS Evening News, compiled from commercial and military news sources around the world.
Good evening, I'm Teresa Waugh. Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega is threatening an all-out offensive to wipe out the U.S.-backed Contras if ceasefire break down. In remarks carried by Nicaraguan state radio, Ortega warned the Sandinistas would use all available force to be rid of the Contras once and for all. Earlier today, Nicaraguan radio reported negotiators agreed on the areas where the rebels will gather during a 60-day ceasefire as peace negotiations go forward. Police in Panama fired tear gas into a group of demonstrators in Panama City who were protesting the rule of strongman Manuel Noriega. Residents tossed garbage into the streets, then set fire to it. A state-owned television station said 2 American soldiers were detained by Panamanian troops during the incident, but U.S. officials say they were released about an hour later. About 800 U.S. Marines will be airlifted to Panama beginning Friday, but the White House says it's not part of the military buildup in that troubled nation. Spokesman Marlon Fitzwater says the troops will spend 3 weeks in jungle training exercises. Meanwhile, the last of 1,300 troops ordered to Panama last week have arrived to bolster security around U.S. bases. The Soviet Union today reaffirmed its plan to pull its troops out of Afghanistan next month if talks on a long-term settlement of the Afghan war produce an agreement soon. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and an Afghan leader said in a joint statement issued after a meeting today that the troop movement withdrawal would start May 15th if negotiations in Geneva are successful in the shortest period. The number of hostages aboard a hijacked jetliner in Iran is reportedly down to about 50 after Arab hijackers released 32 more people. But the official Iranian news agency reports that the hijackers have issued a new threat. They say 3 members of the Kuwaiti royal family still on board would be among the first harmed if their demands are not met. The hijackers want the release of 17 Shiite Muslims jailed in Kuwait. The Iran-Iraq war has been waged from the sky today. The Iraqis fired 4 rockets into Tehran during the morning rush hour. Iran reports 6 children were among the civilians killed in that attack. It also reports 15 people dead in Iraqi air raids elsewhere in Iran. Earlier, Iraq said its plane struck a supertanker near an Iranian oil complex, but there's no independent confirmation of that. Violence in the Gulf seems to have become commonplace. But there is another side to the madness. Mike Silver takes a look at the day-to-day presence of life of U.S. naval forces in the Gulf.
A sleek U.S. Michael Silver in the Persian Gulf.
Despite a disappointing meeting with Israel's Prime Minister, Secretary of State George Shultz is calling the U.S. Middle East peace plan intact and alive. Shultz met with Yitzhak Shamir for 90 minutes yesterday, but apparently failed to narrow their differences over an international peace conference. Shultz is now in Jordan after a meeting with Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in Cairo. Part of the U.S. peace plan is aimed at bringing peace to Israel's occupied territories, and the need for some sort of a peace plan is very evident. An Israeli teenage girl and 2 Palestinians were killed, and 13 other Israeli settlers were injured during a shooting spree and stone-throwing barrage in the West Bank. The girl was among a group of hikers who had stopped for a picnic lunch. The Mideast has been a hot topic among the Democrats looking for votes in New York's April 19th primary. Michael Dukakis courted the Jewish community yesterday by proclaiming the need for a Mideast peace plan that will let Israel live in peace and harmony. Al Gore also pledged his support for Israel, at the same time blasted Dukakis and Jesse Jackson for lacking experience in international affairs. Jackson, who'll be campaigning in New York today, has a big challenge in the Empire State, overcoming his Hymie-town reference to New York City during his 1984 campaign. Jackson apologized for the remark and has since made numerous efforts to mend fences with the Jewish community. Jesse Jackson is giving some Democratic Party leaders some vision of a apocalypse. One Southern Party chairman said Jackson's co-front runner status is creating an awful lot of apprehension about a black man winning the presidential nomination. And party leaders who met with Jackson last week said there were signs of a Stop Jackson movement. Pat Dawson reports.
For Jesse. Pat Dawson, CNN, Washington.
Paul Simon is about to change his role in the race for the Democratic nomination. His spokesman says the Illinois senator won't run the marathon for now, but is not officially dropping out of the competition. Terry Michael says Simon, who's to make an official announcement today, still hopes to gain additional delegates before the party's convention in July. With the Republican fight for the nomination as good as over, the party's concern now is how best to beat the Democrats in November. And George Bush, the shoe-in standard bearer, says that's just what they discussed yesterday when he met with Bob Dole, his one-time biggest rival for the nomination. It was their first private talk since a stormy encounter on the Senate floor in February. The judge who's been overseeing the Iran-Contra case says he wants to streamline procedures and hopes to get the case to trial as quickly as possible. With that in mind, a U.S. district judge has rejected a proposal by independent prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, who wants to prevent the unauthorized disclosure of classified material related to the case. Oliver North's diary will get a going over by the congressional panel investigating Latin America's drug trade. John Kerry, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, says the committee will look for any links between traffickers and the Reagan administration's efforts to supply the Nicaraguan rebels. The stock market skied high today as the Dow Jones Industrial shot up more than 64 points. That was the second largest gain of the year. And EBS News will continue. A spectacular blast-off in the darkness launched a Trident II submarine missile early this morning from a ground pad at Cape Canaveral. It's the 10th launch of the Trident II weapon system since the first failure in January. As we all know, it's tax season again, and the Internal Revenue Service wants to clear up some confusion about a couple of special provisions in the tax law for people overseas. Steve Tardy reports from Washington.
Perfect example.
Even as Italian investigators are looking for a suspect in yesterday's bombing of a U.S. military club in Naples, there's a claim of responsibility in the case. A man calling a French news agency office in Rome today claimed responsibility for the attack for a group called the Organization of Jihad Brigades. The statement by the caller said American imperialists must die for the U.S. bombing of Libya 2 years ago. Even though investigators say a Japanese member of a terrorist group with Middle East links, the Red Army is the prime suspect in the bombing. They're taking the claim seriously. Officials say they believe the Red Army didn't act alone. The member of a Japanese group is accused of renting a car that blew up. He says the suspect is a known international terrorist who is still at large. He's also wanted in connection with rocket and bomb attacks on the U.S. and British embassies in Rome last June. A suspected member of the same Japanese terrorist group is being arraigned in Newark, New Jersey today. The 35-year-old man was arrested at a rest stop on New Jersey Turnpike Tuesday after a state trooper found 3 sophisticated pipe bombs in his car. Federal authorities aren't sure what he was up to, but say he entered the U.S. last month on a visa he got in Paris with a phony passport. The hijackers of a Kuwaiti airliner continue to hold 31 captives in the 11th day of the ordeal with no end in sight. Negotiators in Algiers have resumed negotiations with the gunmen today. A 55-year-old man freed by the hijackers yesterday told of terrible conditions aboard the plane. He says he and other hostages were beaten frequently and that the jet's center doors were wired with explosives. Slowly but surely, the USS Samuel B. Roberts is heading to port in Bahrain. Pentagon sources say it appears the frigate hit a mine. Officials say 10 crewmen were injured when the underwater explosion tore open the hull of the warship. 2 more Arabs are dead following another day of violence in the Israeli-occupied territories. They were shot by Israeli soldiers who also wounded 4 others. Among those injured was a 12-year-old Palestinian boy who had written an open letter to a Jewish boy saying the violence kills, in his words, innocents like you and me. The Senate is taking a swipe at Mexico. It has voted overwhelmingly to slap aid and trade sanctions to the Mexican government for failing to do enough in the war on drugs. Earlier, the Senate refused to impose sanctions on the Bahamas for failing to do enough in the war on drugs.